The courtroom buzzed with tension as J.D. Vance walked through the heavy wooden doors. Camera flashes lit up the hallway behind him, and reporters shouted questions that echoed off the marble walls. He straightened his tie and took a deep breath. Today was supposed to be a simple hearing about campaign finance violations, but something felt different in the air. Judge Patricia Morrison sat behind her bench like a queen on her throne. Her black robes seemed to make her look larger than life, and her cold gray eyes followed every movement in her courtroom. She had been a judge for 23 years, and everyone knew she didn't like politicians, especially politicians who thought they were above the law. J.D.'s lawyer, Michael Chen, whispered something in his ear as they approached their table. The prosecution team sat across from them, shuffling through thick folders of documents. The gallery was packed with reporters, political supporters, and curious citizens who had managed to get seats for what promised to be an interesting show. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison," called the bailiff, a heavy-set man with a gruff voice. Everyone stood as Judge Morrison entered and took her seat. She banged her gavel once, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. "Be seated," she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of decades of legal authority. The hearing began with the prosecutor reading the charges: campaign finance violations, improper use of funds, failure to report donations properly. Standard political stuff, J.D. thought to himself. He had seen worse cases disappear with the right legal strategy, but Judge Morrison seemed unusually aggressive from the start. She interrupted the defense multiple times, her questions sharp and pointed. When J.D.'s lawyer tried to present evidence that the violations were minor and technical, she cut him off. "Mr. Chen, I don't want to hear excuses," she snapped. "The law is the law, regardless of who your client thinks he is." J.D. felt his face flush with anger. He had always prided himself on following the rules, even when other politicians bent them. These charges were based on paperwork errors, nothing more. He leaned forward and whispered to his lawyer, but Judge Morrison's eagle eyes caught the movement. "Mr. Vance, do you have something to say to this court?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. J.D. stood up slowly. His lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to stop him, but J.D. gently pulled away. He had spent years in politics, dealing with hostile crowds and aggressive reporters. One bitter judge wasn't going to intimidate him. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of these charges," J.D. said, his voice calm but firm. Judge Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "A misunderstanding? Mr. Vance, are you suggesting that this court doesn't understand the law?" "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply saying that the evidence will show these were honest mistakes, not intentional violations." The judge leaned forward, her face darkening. "Honest mistakes? Mr. Vance, you're a lawyer yourself. You know better than most people how important it is to follow campaign finance laws. Are you telling me that someone with your education and experience just happened to make multiple honest mistakes?" J.D. felt the trap closing around him, but he couldn't back down now. The reporters were scribbling furiously, and he knew every word would be analyzed and reported. His political career depended on how he handled this moment. "Your Honor, mistakes happen to everyone. Even judges make mistakes sometimes." The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Morrison's face turned red with anger, and her hands gripped the edges of her bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What did you just say?" she whispered, but her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. J.D. realized he had gone too far, but there was no taking it back now. "I simply meant that we're all human, Your Honor. We all make errors in judgment from time to time." Judge Morrison stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Mr. Vance, you have just shown this court exactly the kind of arrogance and disrespect that got you into this mess in the first place. You think being a politician puts you above the law, above criticism, above accountability." "That's not what I meant at all," J.D. protested, but the judge wasn't finished. Oh, but it is exactly what you meant. You waltz into my courtroom with your expensive suit and your political connections, thinking you can charm your way out of legal consequences. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Vance. In this courtroom, I am the authority. Not you, not your party, not your donors. Me. The prosecutor was trying hard not to smile. This was going better than they could have hoped. JD's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Judge Morrison continued her tirade. You politicians are all the same. You think rules don't apply to you. You think you can say whatever you want, do whatever you want, and then make excuses when you get caught. Well, I've had enough of politicians like you thinking they're special. JD's anger finally boiled over. Your Honor, I came here today prepared to accept responsibility for any genuine mistakes. But what I'm seeing isn't justice. It's a personal vendetta against politicians in general and me in particular. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Several reporters were already typing on their phones, sending updates to their newsrooms. This was turning into the kind of courtroom drama that would dominate news cycles for days. A vendetta, Judge Morrison repeated, her voice rising. Mr. Vance, you have just accused a sitting judge of bias and misconduct in open court. Do you understand the gravity of what you just said? I understand that I'm watching a judge let personal feelings interfere with legal proceedings, JD shot back. Judge Morrison's face was now bright red with fury. That's it. Mr. Vance, you are in contempt of this court. Bailiff, take him into custody immediately. The bailiff moved toward JD, handcuffs ready. JD's lawyer jumped up, trying to calm the situation, but it was too late. The damage had been done. As the handcuffs clicked around JD's wrists, he looked directly at Judge Morrison. This isn't over, Your Honor. The truth has a way of coming out. Judge Morrison banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to the chaos that had erupted in her courtroom. Clear the court! Everyone out! Now! But even as JD was led away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Morrison's reaction had been too extreme, too personal. There was something else going on, here, something beyond simple judicial authority, and he was going to find out what it was. The holding cell was cold and smelled like disinfectant mixed with fear. JD sat on the hard metal bench, still wearing his expensive suit, now wrinkled from the handcuffs and rough treatment. The other inmates stared at him with curiosity. It wasn't every day a politician ended up in their temporary home. Michael Chen arrived 3 hours later, carrying a briefcase and wearing a worried expression. The guard led him into the small meeting room where JD was waiting. This is a disaster, Michael said, dropping his briefcase on the scratch table. The news is already calling it Vance's courtroom meltdown. CNN has been running the footage nonstop. JD rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. How bad is it? Bad. Really bad. Judge Morrison held you in contempt and set bail at $50,000. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that every major news outlet is painting you as an arrogant politician who disrespected a respected judge. Respected? JD laughed bitterly. Did you see what happened in there, Michael? That wasn't justice. That was a personal attack. Michael opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. Maybe. But here's what I don't understand. I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've never seen Judge Morrison lose control like that. She's known for being tough but fair, cold, maybe, but professional. Exactly. So what changed? Michael scrolled through his tablet, showing JD news articles and social media posts. The internet is having a field day with this. Dr. Vance vs. Morrison is trending on Twitter. Half the people think you're an entitled brat, and the other half think the judge went too far. JD studied the tablet screen, reading headlines like, Politician's tantrum lands him in jail, and Judge Morrison puts arrogant Vance in his place. But there were other headlines, too. Did Judge Morrison cross the line? And judicial overreach in Vance's case? Michael, I need you to do something for me. I need you to dig into Judge Morrison's background. Her recent cases, her financial records, her political connections, everything. JD, that's dangerous territory. If she finds out we're investigating her, she could make your life even more miserable. My life is already miserable. And something tells me there's more to this story than what happened in that courtroom today. While JD sat in jail waiting for bail to be processed, Judge Morrison was in her chambers, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Her assistant, Sarah, watched nervously from the doorway. Your Honor, maybe you should go home early today. The media attention has been intense. Judge Morrison stopped pacing and turned to face Sarah. That arrogant little worm thinks he can waltz into my courtroom and disrespect me? He has no idea who he's dealing with. Ma'am, I've never seen you so upset about a defendant before. Usually you handle these political cases with such composure. The judge's expression changed for just a moment, a flicker of something that might have been fear or guilt. But it passed quickly, replaced by her usual mask of stern authority. This case is different, Sarah. Politicians like Vance think they're untouchable. They think their money and connections put them above the law. Well, I'm going to show him that in my courtroom, justice is blind to political status. But Sarah noticed something odd. Judge Morrison's hands were shaking slightly as she organized papers on her desk. In all her years working for the judge, Sarah had never seen her this rattled by a simple contempt citation. Later that evening, after JD had finally made bail and returned to his apartment, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, searching through news articles about Judge Morrison. Most of the coverage was standard biographical information. Born in Ohio, law degree from Columbia, appointed to the bench by a Republican governor, known for tough sentences and no-nonsense courtroom management. But as JD dug deeper, he found some interesting details. Judge Morrison had been involved in several high-profile cases over the years, including a corruption scandal involving a state senator 5 years ago. She had been praised for her handling of that case, which resulted in a conviction and prison sentence for the senator JD made. Notes as he read. Morrison seemed to have a particular interest in political corruption cases. She had sought them out, volunteered to preside over them when other judges might have preferred to avoid the media attention. That was unusual for a judge who otherwise seemed to value her privacy. His phone rang, interrupting his research. It was Michael. JD, I've been making some calls. I think you're onto something with Judge Morrison. What did you find? Nothing concrete yet, but I talked to a few lawyers who've appeared before her recently. They all said the same thing. She's been different lately. More aggressive, more personal in her attacks on defendants. And here's the interesting part. It's only been happening with political cases. JD leaned forward, his interest piqued. How long has this been going on? About 6 months, maybe a little longer. One lawyer told me she seemed almost obsessed with a case involving a city councilman. She kept the trial going longer than necessary, asked unusually detailed questions about the defendant's personal finances and political connections. Did the councilman win or lose? Lost. Got 2 years in prison for taking bribes. But here's the weird part. The evidence was pretty thin. Most lawyers thought it was a case that should have resulted in probation at most. JD felt pieces of a puzzle starting to come together, but he couldn't see the full picture yet. Michael, I need you to get me everything you can on Judge Morrison's financial records from the past year. Bank statements, investment accounts, property records, everything. JD, that's going to be difficult. Judge's financial information is protected, and if we get caught digging into her private affairs illegally, I'm not asking you to break the law. But there are public records, campaign contribution databases, property transactions. Start there. After Michael hung up, JD continued his research late into the night. He found articles about Judge Morrison's tough stance on political corruption, her speeches about the importance of holding public officials accountable, her reputation as a judge who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But he also found something else. A small news item from 8 months ago about Judge Morrison's son, David Morrison, age 26, who had been arrested for drug possession and assault charges. The charges had been dropped quietly, with no explanation given to the media, J.D. stared at the screen, his mind racing. A judge's son getting arrested and having charges dropped wasn't necessarily unusual, but the timing was interesting. The arrest had happened about a month before Judge Morrison's behavior in political corruption cases had supposedly changed. He bookmarked the article and kept searching. David Morrison's arrest wasn't the only interesting thing he found. Judge Morrison had also purchased a new house 6 months ago, paying cash for a property worth $300,000 more than her judicial salary should have allowed. J.D. leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle starting to form. A picture he didn't like. Judge Morrison's sudden aggression toward political defendants, her son's mysteriously dropped charges, a house she shouldn't have been able to afford. None of it proved anything yet, but it all pointed toward the possibility that the respected Judge Morrison might not be as clean as everyone thought. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging or you'll regret it." J.D. stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. Someone was definitely worried about what he might find, which meant he was on the right track. The next morning, J.D. woke up to his doorbell ringing repeatedly. Through the peephole, he saw a young woman in a dark coat, looking nervous and checking over her shoulder every few seconds. She didn't look like a reporter, and she was too well dressed to be a process server. "Mr. Vance? My name is Lisa Chang. I work for the State Attorney General's office. I need to speak with you urgently." J.D. opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. "What about?" "Judge Morrison. I think you're in danger, and I think I can help you. But we can't talk here." 30 minutes later, they sat in a small coffee shop across town. Lisa Chang looked to be in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was taking a big risk. "I've been investigating Judge Morrison for the past 4 months, she said quietly, glancing around the nearly empty coffee shop. "What happened in your courtroom yesterday confirms everything I suspected." "What kind of investigation?" Lisa pulled out a folder from her briefcase, checking again to make sure no one was watching them. "It started when we noticed unusual patterns in her sentencing. Political corruption cases were getting much harsher sentences than similar cases handled by other judges. At first, we thought she was just tough on political crime, but then we started looking deeper." She opened the folder and showed J.D. several documents: bank records, property transactions, phone records. "Judge Morrison has been receiving payments from something called Integrity Solutions, LLC, monthly. Deposits of $10,000 for the past 8 months. J.D. studied the documents. "What's Integrity Solutions?" That's where it gets interesting. Integrity Solutions is owned by Marcus Webb, a private investigator who specializes in political opposition research. He's the guy candidates hire when they want to dig up dirt on their opponents. And Webb has been paying Judge Morrison? That's what it looks like. But here's the really scary part. Webb's biggest client over the past year has been congressional candidate Robert Sterling. Sterling is running against incumbent Tom Bradley for the House seat in this district. J.D. felt a chill run down his spine. "Tom Bradley is one of my biggest political allies. We've campaigned together, fundraised together." Exactly. And guess what Judge Morrison has been doing? She's been systematically targeting Bradley's political allies with unusually harsh sentences in corruption cases, making them look bad, damaging their reputations, weakening Bradley's support network. Lisa showed him more documents. "Look at this. City Councilman James Parker, convicted of minor campaign finance violations 6 months ago. Normal sentence would have been probation. Morrison gave him 18 months in prison. State Representative Karen Williams, found guilty of improper use of state resources, should have been a fine and community service. Morrison gave her a year in jail. All Bradley allies? Every single one. And now you show up in her courtroom, another Bradley supporter? Another chance for her to flex her muscles and show that Bradley's people are corrupt. JD sat back in his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. Why are you telling me this? Why haven't you arrested her? Lisa's expression grew grim. Because we need more evidence. What we have is suggestive, but not conclusive. A good defense. Lawyer could argue the payments were for legitimate legal consulting, that the harsh sentences were just coincidental. We need proof that she's deliberately throwing cases to help Sterling's campaign. What kind of proof? We need to catch her in the act. We need recordings of her coordinating with Webb or Sterling. We need documents that explicitly show the conspiracy. And we need someone on the inside to help us get that evidence. JD understood what she was asking. You want me to go back into her courtroom and try to provoke her into revealing something incriminating? Not exactly. What I want is for you to help us set up a situation where she reveals her true motives. Your case goes back to court next week. If we can get her to say something on the record that shows her bias, something that proves she's not being impartial, we might be able to build a case. That's incredibly dangerous. If she suspects what we're doing, she could throw me in prison for years. Lisa nodded. I know, but Mr. Vance, she's corrupting the entire judicial system in this district. Other judges are starting to wonder why she's so eager to take political cases. Defense attorneys are avoiding cases in her court. The whole system is breaking down because one judge has decided to play politics instead of administering justice. While JD and Lisa were meeting, Judge Morrison was in her office making a phone call she hoped no one would ever find out about. Marcus, we have a problem, she said into her secure phone. Marcus Webb's voice was calm and professional. What kind of problem, Patricia? Vance is digging into my background. My assistant overheard him talking to his lawyer about investigating my finances. That's concerning, but not necessarily dangerous. Your financial arrangements with my company are completely legal. Consulting fees for legal research. But what if he finds out about David? What if he discovers the real reason I started working? With you? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Patricia, we've been through this. Your son's charges were dropped through normal legal channels. There's no evidence of any impropriety. Normal legal channels? Judge Morrison's voice rose with stress. Marcus, you blackmailed the prosecutor's office into dropping those charges. You threatened to expose their own corruption if they didn't let David walk free. I provided information about prosecutorial misconduct to the appropriate authorities. The fact that they chose to reconsider your son's case was their decision. Judge Morrison knew she was in too deep to back out now. When David had been arrested for drug possession and assault, she had been desperate. A judge's son going to prison would have destroyed her career and her reputation. When Marcus Webb had approached her with an offer to make the charges disappear in exchange for her cooperation in targeting certain political figures, it had seemed like a lifeline. Now it felt like a noose around her neck. Marcus, what if Vance figures out the connection? What if he realizes that Sterling is behind all of this? Then we'll deal with that problem when it happens. For now, your job is to continue handling political corruption cases the way we discussed. Vance's case gives you another opportunity to demonstrate that Bradley's allies are corrupt and unfit for public service. But after yesterday's outburst, everyone is watching my courtroom. If I come down too hard on Vance, it's going to look suspicious. Then don't come down too hard. Be professional, be fair, but make sure he's convicted. A conviction for campaign finance violations will be enough to damage his credibility and hurt Bradley's reputation by association. After hanging up, Judge A. Morrison sat in her chair, staring out the window at the city below. She had spent 23 years building a reputation for integrity and fairness. Now she was taking bribes and manipulating the justice system for political purposes, all to protect a son who probably deserved to face the consequences of his actions. But there was no going back now. If the truth came out, she would lose everything. Her career, her reputation, her freedom. David would probably end up in prison. Anyway, and she would be right there with him. Her phone rang again. This time, it was her assistant. Your Honor, I have some disturbing news. Someone from the Attorney General's office was asking questions about your recent cases. They wanted to know about sentencing patterns in political corruption cases. Judge Morrison felt her heart skip a beat. What did you tell them? Nothing, of course. But, Your Honor, I think they're investigating you. Judge Morrison hung up and immediately called Marcus Webb again. We have a bigger problem than I thought, she said when he answered. The Attorney General's office is investigating me. How do you know? My assistant just told me. Someone was asking questions about my sentencing patterns. Patricia, listen. To me carefully. You need to stay calm and act normally. Continue with your regular caseload. Handle Vance's case professionally and don't do anything that might seem suspicious. But what if they already have evidence? What if they know about the payments? If they had solid evidence, you'd already be under arrest. They're fishing, looking for probable cause. As long as you don't give them anything else to work with, they can't touch you. But as Judge Morrison hung up the phone, she realized that Marcus Webb didn't understand the real problem. The real problem wasn't the Attorney General's investigation. The real problem was that she had created so many enemies in the past 8 months that half the legal community in the city would be happy to see her fall, and J.D. Vance was just the kind of person who wouldn't give up until he found the truth. 3 days before his next court appearance, J.D. received an unexpected visitor. Sarah, Judge Morrison's assistant, knocked on his apartment door at 9 o'clock at night, looking terrified and constantly checking over her shoulder. Mr. Vance, I need to talk to you. It's about Judge Morrison. J.D. let her in, noting how her hands shook as she clutched a manila envelope to her chest. I could lose my job for this. I could go to prison, but I can't watch this happen anymore, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. What's in the envelope? Sarah handed it to him with trembling fingers. Copies of Judge Morrison's phone records, meeting schedules, and bank statements. I've been keeping extra copies of everything for months because something felt wrong. J.D. opened the envelope and spread the documents across his coffee table. Why are you doing this? Because I've worked for her for 8 years, and she used to be a good judge. Tough but fair. These past few months, it's like she's become a different person. Angry, paranoid, making decisions that don't make sense. J.D. studied the phone records. Multiple calls to numbers he didn't recognize, but the frequency and timing were interesting. Lots of calls right before major political corruption cases, and right after sentencing hearings. Sarah, do you know who she's been talking to? Some of these numbers I recognize. This one is Marcus Webb, the private investigator. She talks to him almost every day now. This one is someone named Robert Sterling. J.D.'s blood ran cold. Lisa Chang had been right. Judge Morrison was directly communicating with Sterling, the man running against his ally Tom Bradley. There's more, Sarah continued. Judge Morrison has been meeting with people in her chambers after hours. Private meetings that aren't on her official calendar. I stay late sometimes to finish paperwork, and I've seen men in expensive suits coming and going. Can you identify any of them? Sarah pulled out her phone and showed J.D. several photos she had taken discreetly. I started taking pictures because I was scared. I didn't know who these people were or why they were meeting with her in secret. J.D. recognized 2 of the men immediately. One was Marcus Webb, whose photo he had found online during his research. The other was Robert Sterling himself, whose campaign photos were plastered all over the district. Sarah, this is incredible evidence, but it's also incredibly dangerous. If Judge Morrison finds out you took these photos, she can't find out. Mr. Vance, I need you to promise me something. When this all comes out, I need protection. I have a daughter, and I can't afford to lose my job, but I also can't be part of this corruption anymore. J.D. assured her that he would do everything possible to protect her, then spent the rest of the night studying the documents she had provided. The pattern was clear now. Judge Morrison would receive a call from either Webb or Sterling. Then, within days, she would schedule a hearing for a political corruption case. After the hearing, if the defendant was convicted and sentenced harshly, she would receive a payment from Integrity Solutions, LLC. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten note in Judge Morrison's own handwriting. Bradley allies. Maximum. Sentences. Make examples. Sterling needs clean sweep before election. The next morning, J.D. called Lisa Chang and arranged to meet her at the same coffee shop. When he showed her Sarah's evidence, her eyes widened with excitement. This is exactly what we needed. With this evidence and Sarah's testimony, we can build a solid case for judicial corruption, conspiracy, and election interference. What's our next move? We need to get Judge Morrison on record admitting to her bias. Tomorrow, I want you to go back into her courtroom, but this time we'll be ready for her. Lisa explained the plan. J.D. would wear a wire during his court appearance. They would try to provoke Judge Morrison into making statements that revealed her political motivations. Meanwhile, FBI agents would be stationed outside the courthouse, ready to arrest her as soon as they had enough evidence on tape. What about my case? What happens to the charges against me? If this works, your charges will be dismissed. A conviction obtained through judicial corruption is automatically invalid. But J.D., you need to understand the risk. If Judge Morrison suspects you're wearing a wire, if she figures out what we're doing, she could hold you in contempt again and throw you in jail before we can stop her. J.D. thought about Tom Bradley, about all the other political figures whose careers had been destroyed by Judge Morrison's corrupt scheme. He thought about the damage to the judicial system, to public trust in the courts. I'll do it. While J.D. was meeting with Lisa Chang, Judge Morrison was having her own crisis meeting with Marcus Webb and Robert Sterling in her chambers. The three of them sat around her conference table, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "We have a serious problem," Webb said, spreading his own set of documents on the table. "My sources tell me that the Attorney General's office has opened a formal investigation into Judge Morrison's court." Sterling, a tall man with perfectly styled gray hair and cold blue eyes, slammed his hand on the table. "How did this happen?" "You assured me that our arrangement was foolproof." "It was foolproof until Vance started asking questions," Judge Morrison replied. "And until my assistant started acting nervous and suspicious." "What do you mean suspicious?" Webb asked. "She's been asking too many questions about my schedule, about my meetings. Yesterday, I caught her looking through files she had no business accessing." Sterling stood up and began pacing. "We're 3 weeks away from the election. 3 weeks. If this comes out now, it will destroy my campaign and probably send all of us to prison." "Maybe we should cut our losses," Judge Morrison suggested. "Stop the payments, end the arrangement, hope they don't have enough evidence to prosecute." "Absolutely not," Sterling snapped. "We're too close to success. Bradley is already losing ground because of the corruption scandals surrounding his allies. One more high-profile conviction and his political career is finished." Webb pulled out his laptop and showed them polling data. "Sterling is right. The scandals have damaged Bradley significantly. But if Vance beats these charges, if he comes out looking like a victim of judicial persecution, it could actually help Bradley by making him look like a martyr." "So what do you suggest?" Judge Morrison asked. "We stick to the plan. You handle Vance's case professionally but firmly. Convict him on the charges, give him a reasonable sentence that doesn't look vindictive. The media attention from his outburst will overshadow any claims of unfairness." Sterling nodded approvingly. "And after the election, we can discuss ending our arrangement. Once I'm in office and Bradley is out, we won't need to target his allies anymore." Judge Morrison felt sick to her stomach. She had started this arrangement to protect her son, but now she was trapped in a web of corruption that seemed to grow larger every day. Every decision she made pulled her deeper into the conspiracy. "There's one more thing," Webb said. "I've been monitoring Vance's communications. He's been in contact with someone from the Attorney General's office. We need to assume they're planning something for tomorrow's hearing." "What kind of something?" Judge Morrison asked. "I don't know yet, but I suggest you be very careful about what you say in court tomorrow. Assume everything is being recorded." After the men left, Judge Morrison sat alone in her chambers, staring at the wall of law books that had once represented everything she believed in. Justice, integrity, the rule of law. Now they seemed like relics from another life, reminders of the person she used to be before fear and desperation had turned her into something she never thought she could become. Her phone buzzed with a text, message from an unknown number. Tomorrow everything changes. Last chance to do the right thing. Judge Morrison stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it. But she couldn't delete the growing certainty that tomorrow's hearing was going to be the most important day of her life, and possibly the last day of her career. The morning of the hearing, J.D. stood in the FBI field office while technicians attached a small recording device to his chest. The wire was nearly invisible, hidden under his shirt and tie. Lisa Chang watched nervously as Agent Rodriguez explained how the device worked. The microphone is highly sensitive, so it will pick up everything said in the courtroom. We'll be monitoring from a van outside the courthouse. If Judge Morrison says anything that confirms the conspiracy, we'll move in immediately, J.D. tested the device, speaking in normal conversational tones while the agents listened through their headphones. Everything was working perfectly. Remember, Lisa said, try to get her to talk about her sentencing decisions for other political cases. If she admits to treating Bradley's allies more harshly than other defendants, that's evidence of bias and corruption. What if she doesn't take the bait? Then we'll have to rely on the documentary evidence Sarah provided. It's strong, but a confession would seal the case. An hour later, J.D. walked up the courthouse steps with his lawyer, Michael Chen. The media, attention was even more intense than the first time. News vans lined the street, and reporters pushed forward with microphones and cameras as they approached the entrance. "Mr. Vance, are you prepared to apologize to Judge Morrison today?" shouted one reporter. "Mr. Vance, do you regret your outburst in court?" called another. J.D. ignored the questions and pushed through the crowd. Inside the courthouse, he could see FBI agents positioned discreetly throughout the lobby and hallways. Everything was in place. Judge Morrison was already on the bench when they entered the courtroom. She looked composed and professional, showing no signs of the stress she must have been feeling. But J.D. noticed dark circles under her eyes and a slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled through papers. "Court is now in session," announced the bailiff. Judge Morrison banged her gavel and looked directly at J.D. "Mr. Vance, before we proceed with today's hearing, I want to address what happened during our last session. Your behavior was unacceptable, and I hope you've had time to reflect on the importance of showing proper respect for this court." J.D. stood up slowly. "Your Honor, I have had time to reflect, and I've been thinking a lot about the concept of respect. I respect the law, I respect the judicial system, and I respect judges who apply the law fairly and impartially." Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting that this court has been anything other than fair and impartial?" "I'm simply saying that I believe all defendants deserve equal treatment under the law, regardless of their political affiliations." The prosecutor, sensing an opportunity, stood up. "Your Honor, the defendant seems to be continuing his pattern of disrespectful behavior toward this court." Judge Morrison held up her hand. "I can handle this myself, Counselor." She turned back to J.D. "Mr. Vance, let me be very clear about something. This court treats all defendants equally. I don't care if they're politicians, business leaders, or ordinary citizens. The law applies to everyone the same way." J.D. felt his pulse quicken. This was the opening he needed. "That's reassuring to hear, Your Honor, because I've been researching your recent cases and I noticed some interesting patterns." "What kind of patterns?" Judge Morrison asked, her voice sharp with warning. "Well, for instance, city councilman James Parker received 18 months in prison for campaign finance violations that were very similar to the charges against me. State Representative Karen Williams got a year in jail for improper use of state resources. Both cases involved much smaller amounts of money than typical corruption cases, yet both received unusually harsh sentences." Judge Morrison's face was turning red again. "Mr. Vance, Are you questioning this court's sentencing decisions? I'm questioning whether political considerations played a role in those sentences. Both Parker and Williams were strong supporters of Congressman Tom Bradley. Both received sentences that were significantly harsher than defendants in similar cases who weren't connected to Bradley. The courtroom was completely silent. Every reporter was scribbling furiously, and several were holding up their phones to record the exchange. "Mr. Vance, you are walking a very dangerous line," Judge Morrison said, her voice low and threatening. "Your Honor, I'm simply pointing out facts that are part of the public record. Unless there's some reason you don't want those facts discussed in your courtroom?" Judge Morrison stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. Those defendants received appropriate sentences for their crimes. The fact that they were associated with Congressman Bradley is irrelevant to their punishment. "But is it irrelevant to your decision-making process?" J.D. pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like being a Bradley ally is the fastest way to get a harsh sentence in your courtroom." "That is completely false," Judge Morrison shouted. "I sentence defendants based on the law and the facts of their cases, not their political connections." "Then why do all of Bradley's supporters seem to get maximum sentences while defendants, with no political connections, get probation or suspended sentences for similar crimes?" Judge Morrison realized she was being trapped, but her anger was overriding her caution. Perhaps Bradley's supporters tend to be more corrupt than the average defendant. Perhaps they think their political connections will protect them from consequences. The words hung in the air like a confession. J.D. felt the wire against his chest, recording every word. "So you do consider political connections when making sentencing decisions?" J.D. asked quietly. Judge Morrison realized what she had just said. Her face went pale and she gripped the edge of her bench. "That's not... I didn't mean..." "Your Honor, you just admitted that you believe Bradley's supporters are inherently more corrupt than other defendants. How is that not political bias?" The prosecutor was frantically trying to object, but Judge Morrison waved him off. She was staring at J.D. with a mixture of hatred and fear. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Mr. Vance? You think you can come into my courtroom and manipulate me into saying something I'll regret?" "I think I'm trying to expose corruption in the judicial system," J.D. replied. "And I think you're making my case for me." Judge Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and saw a message from Marcus Webb. "Stop talking. Get out of there now." But it was too late. Through the courtroom windows, she could see FBI agents entering the building. The trap had been sprung. "Your Honor," J.D. said, his voice now calm and confident, "I think there are some people who would like to speak with you." The courtroom doors burst open and Agent Rodriguez walked in with 6 other FBI agents. "Judge Patricia Morrison, you are under arrest for judicial corruption, conspiracy to interfere with elections, and accepting bribes." Judge Morrison's legs gave out, and she collapsed into her chair. The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters surged forward and court security tried to maintain order. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Rodriguez continued as 2 agents approached the bench. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the handcuffs were placed around Judge Morrison's wrists, she looked at J.D. with a mixture of defeat and grudging respect. "You were right about one thing, Mr. Vance. The truth does have a way of coming out." The bailiff was banging his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but the damage was done. Judge Morrison was led out of her own courtroom in handcuffs. While cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Michael Chen leaned over to J.D. "I think it's safe to say your charges are going to be dismissed." J.D. nodded, but he wasn't feeling victorious. He was thinking about all the other defendants who had been victimized by Judge Morrison's corruption. All the people who had received harsh sentences not because they deserved them, but because they were inconvenient to Robert Sterling's political ambitions. Lisa Chang appeared at his side as the courtroom began to empty. "We got everything we needed." Her admission about treating Bradley's supporters more harshly, her acknowledgement of political bias, all of it recorded and admissible in court. What happens now? Now we arrest Marcus Webb and Robert Sterling. Judge Morrison will probably cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. This conspiracy is about to unravel completely. As J.D. left the courthouse, he was surrounded by reporters again. But this time, their questions were different. Mr. Vance, how did you know Judge Morrison was corrupt? Will you be filing a lawsuit against the court system? Do you think this scandal will affect the congressional election? J.D. paused on the courthouse steps and looked back at the building where justice had been perverted for political gain. Today proved that no one is above the law. Not politicians, not judges, not anyone. The system worked because people were brave enough to stand up and demand accountability. But even as he spoke those words, J.D. knew the real work was just beginning. Judge Morrison's arrest was just the first domino to fall. Before this was over, the entire corrupt network that had tried to manipulate the election would be exposed and prosecuted. And J.D. Vance, who had walked into that courtroom as a defendant facing campaign finance charges, was walking out as the man who had helped bring down one of the biggest judicial corruption scandals in the state's history. 2 weeks after Judge Morrison's dramatic arrest, the corruption scandal had exploded into a national story. Every major news network was covering what reporters were calling the Morrison conspiracy, and the ripple effects were being felt throughout. The political establishment. J.D. sat in the FBI field office, reviewing transcripts of recorded phone calls between Judge Morrison, Marcus Webb, and Robert Sterling. Lisa Chang sat across from him, organizing evidence for the upcoming trials. Judge Morrison has been very cooperative, Lisa said, flipping through a thick folder. She's provided details about the entire operation going back 8 months. Webb approached her right after her son's arrest, offered to make the charges disappear in exchange for her help targeting Bradley's political allies. What about Sterling? Is he talking? Sterling is claiming he had no knowledge of the illegal payments to Judge Morrison. He says Webb was acting as an independent contractor and went beyond what he was authorized to do. J.D. laughed bitterly. Even with recorded phone calls of him coordinating with Morrison about specific cases? His lawyers are arguing that those calls were just normal political strategy discussions. They're claiming he never explicitly ordered her to impose harsh sentences. What does Webb say? Webb is trying to cut a deal. He's willing to testify against Sterling in exchange for a reduced sentence. Apparently, Sterling knew about every aspect of the conspiracy and personally approved the payments to Judge Morrison. While they were talking, Agent Rodriguez entered the room with a grim expression. We just got some disturbing news. Judge Morrison's son David was found dead in his apartment this morning, apparent suicide. J.D. felt a chill run through him. Suicide? He left a note saying he couldn't live with the guilt of knowing his mother had destroyed her career to protect him. The note also contained some interesting details about how the conspiracy started. Rodriguez handed them a copy of David Morrison's suicide note. In shaky handwriting, David had confessed that his drug and assault charges had been completely legitimate. He had been dealing drugs to pay for his own addiction, and he had assaulted a police officer during his arrest. When Marcus Webb had offered to make the charges disappear, David had begged his mother to accept the deal. He says here that he tried to convince his mother to stop working with Webb and Sterling, Lisa said, reading the note. He knew what she was doing was wrong, but he was too scared of going to prison to tell her to stop. This is going to destroy her, J.D. said quietly. She sacrificed everything to protect him, and now he's gone anyway. The suicide had immediate political ramifications. Robert Sterling, who had been maintaining his innocence and staying in the congressional race, suddenly announced he was withdrawing from the election. His campaign released a statement saying he needed to focus on clearing his name from the corruption allegations. But the damage to his reputation was already done. Tom Bradley, who had been trailing in the polls because of the scandals affecting his allies, suddenly found himself running unopposed for re-election. 3 days later, J.D. was called to testify before a grand jury that was investigating the full scope of the conspiracy. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rebecca Martinez, walked him through the events leading up to Judge Morrison's arrest. Mr. Vance, in your opinion, how many cases might have been affected by Judge Morrison's corrupt behavior? Based on the evidence I've seen, at least 15 political corruption cases over the past 8 months. Maybe more. Judge Morrison was specifically targeting defendants who were connected to Congressman Bradley or who might have been useful to Bradley's campaign. And what was the ultimate goal of this conspiracy? To manipulate the judicial system to influence the outcome of a congressional election. Sterling and Webb wanted to destroy Bradley's political network by making his allies look corrupt and unfit for office. Did they succeed? J.D. thought about all the lives that had been ruined by false or exaggerated corruption convictions. Careers destroyed. Families torn apart. Public trust in the judicial system damaged. They succeeded in causing tremendous damage to a lot of innocent people. But they failed in their ultimate goal. The truth came out, and justice is being served. After his testimony, J.D. met with Sarah, Judge Morrison's former assistant, at a small restaurant downtown. Sarah looked exhausted and older than her years. The stress of the past few weeks had taken its toll on everyone involved in the case. "How is Judge Morrison holding up?" J.D. asked. "Terribly. David's death has broken her completely. Her lawyers say she's not even trying to fight the charges anymore. She just wants to plead guilty and get it over with. What about you? Have you found another job?" Sarah shook her head. "Who's going to hire the assistant of a corrupt judge? Even though I helped expose the corruption, people still associate me with what happened. I'm thinking about leaving the legal field entirely." J.D. felt bad for Sarah. She had risked everything to do the right thing, and now she was paying the price for Judge Morrison's crimes. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you did was incredibly brave. Without your evidence, we never would have been able to prove the conspiracy. Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it." Judge Morrison was a good person who made a terrible mistake trying to protect her son. Now her son is dead, her career is over, and she's going to prison. Did we really accomplish anything? J.D. understood her doubt. The victory felt hollow when he thought about the human cost of the corruption and its exposure. "We prevented Sterling from stealing an election through judicial manipulation. We stopped Judge Morrison from destroying more innocent lives. And we showed that the system can still work when people are willing to stand up for what's right." 6 months later, the trials were over. Judge Morrison had pleaded guilty to all charges and received a sentence of 5 years in federal prison. Marcus Webb had been convicted on conspiracy charges and sentenced to 3 years. Robert Sterling, despite his claims of innocence, had been found guilty on all counts and received the harshest sentence of 10 years. J.D.'s own charges had been dismissed as expected. The prosecutor in his case had admitted that the charges had been politically motivated and that there was insufficient evidence to support a conviction even without the corruption scandal. Tom Bradley had been re-elected to Congress in a landslide victory. The exposure of the conspiracy had actually strengthened his position by making him look like a victim of political persecution. But the real victory wasn't political. It was the restoration of public trust in the judicial system. A new judge had been appointed to replace Morrison, and new procedures had been put in place to monitor judicial behavior and prevent similar corruption in the future. J.D. stood on the courthouse steps where this entire drama had begun, looking up at the building, where Judge Morrison had once wielded absolute power. A bronze plaque had been installed near the entrance, dedicated to the memory of David Morrison and containing a quote about the importance of judicial integrity. Lisa Chang joined him on the steps. She had been promoted within the Attorney General's office and was now leading a task force focused on preventing judicial corruption. "Any regrets?" she asked. J.D. thought about the question seriously. The investigation had consumed months of his life and put him in genuine danger. Judge Morrison's son had died, and several other lives had been ruined or damaged by the scandal. "No regrets," he said finally. Someone had to stop them. If we hadn't acted when we did, how many more innocent people would have been victimized? By their conspiracy? The system worked, Lisa agreed. It took courage and determination, but justice prevailed in the end. As they walked away from the courthouse, J.D. reflected on the lessons learned from the experience. Power corrupts, but corruption can be exposed and defeated when people are willing to stand up and fight for what's right. The justice system isn't perfect, but it's strong enough to survive and correct itself when good people refuse to accept corruption. Judge Morrison had learned that lesson too late. But her downfall had served as a warning to other judges who might be tempted to use their power for personal or political gain. And her son's tragic death had reminded everyone that corruption doesn't just hurt the system, it destroys the lives of real people who get caught in its web. The courthouse remained standing, its promise of justice intact, and J.D. Vance, who had entered as a defendant facing false charges, had helped ensure that promise would be kept for future generations.